Hi everyone. Today we're going to talk about how to supercharge your exposure therapy practices. I've got two links for you to check out in the description. One is to my tips for how to get the most out of exposure, and I'm going to do another video on going over those tips. But the other link is to the exposure practice form, and that's what we're going to be talking about in this video. I often get calls and emails, am I doing exposure therapy right? Can you help me to do it better? How can I do it the right way? And what I do is I send this form. This is the same form that we use in our clinic when we're practicing doing exposure therapy, not just with people who have OCD, but really all sorts of kind of fear-related and anxiety-related problems. So I want to go over this form, how to get the most out of it, how to supercharge your exposure therapy practices. This form is based on the latest inhibitory learning approach to doing exposure therapy, to optimizing exposure therapy. And the idea, and this is important to keep in mind, the goal of exposure therapy is to learn new information. A lot of people think that the key to a successful exposure is habituation, staying in the feared situation long enough that that anxiety starts to decline. And that's great when that happens, but habituation is not the most important thing about doing exposure, and it's not an indicator of whether exposure therapy is successful. The research tells us that the long-term outcome of exposure is not strongly related to habituation. The most important thing to get out of exposure is learning new information. In particular, you want to learn first that the situation that you're afraid of is not as dangerous as you think. You also want to learn that your intrusive thoughts and your anxiety are safe and manageable. And you want to learn that you can manage uncertainty. Remember that exposure needs to be planned. It needs to be systematic. It's not just kind of some sort of random situation that you come upon. You need to plan it out. And that's why the first part of this worksheet is to write down the exact exposure that you're going to do. You're going to describe the exposure. What situations are you going to face? And what anxiety reduction strategies are you going to work on stopping? Remember, it's exposure and response prevention. So you got to face your fear and you got to not do things that are going to make you feel safe in the moment, like compulsive rituals or other sorts of subtle, avoidance strategies or safety-seeking strategies. You can check out my book, Getting Over OCD, for all sorts of examples of different types of situations that you might face if you're doing exposure for your particular version of OCD. Now, the next thing you need to do is we want to write down what exactly is the feared consequence. What are you afraid is going to happen if you do the exposure and you don't do the safety behavior, you don't do a ritual, you don't do avoidance? In other words, when you do exposure and response prevention, what are you afraid might happen? What's the risk? You want to be specific as possible. I will get sick within 24 hours if I touch a toilet. Or I will have hit someone with my car, not realized it, and the police will show up at my house later that day. Or for a specific phobia, this dog is going to bite me if I pet it. Or if it's a social situation, it could be that everyone's going to laugh at me if I gave a wrong answer in class. Something really specific. It needs to be something that you can test out, that you'll know if the feared thing happened or not. It needs to be something that's observable, that's testable. The third thing you want to do is write down how long you can stick with this task. Now, depending on your specific fear, this might be more or less relevant. For someone who has panic attacks and you're doing interoceptive exposure to body sensations, it's going to be very relevant. How long can I go with hyperventilating and making myself feel all panicky before I have to stop or before I, before I faint? If you have OCD, it might be how long can I do this exposure without doing the ritual? So for example, how long can I keep my hands feeling contaminated before I have to wash them? That too is going to be something that you're going to put to the test. We're going to test out whether you can do even better than what you predicted as far as sticking it out in the exposure situation. Now, the part of the form that's about what to do during the exposure really is kind of more optional. For some exposures, you're not going to be able to write down how anxious you feel and what's your urge to do the ritual or the safety behavior during the exposure. It's just kind of practically, it just won't work out. But if you're able to do that, there's nothing wrong with keeping track of your level of anxiety, keeping track of how strong your urge is to do the ritual or to escape, and just to kind of notice how that goes over time. Again, you might have habituation where that anxiety comes down, or you might not, and we're not going to be concerned about that, because if your anxiety goes down, that's great. And if your anxiety doesn't go down, you're still going to learn, I can manage with anxiety. I can get through this exposure even when I'm feeling really anxious. And that's an important thing to learn. The other thing is to describe how you're feeling. Those thoughts, those feelings that are going through your mind, I want you to write them down during the exposure. I'm really freaking out that maybe I'm going to get sick because I touched a bathroom door. Or I'm really concerned that I hit someone with my car and I'm not sure if it was a speed bump or if it was a body, and maybe the police are going to show up at my door later on. The idea of this exercise is to help you to lean in to those unwanted thoughts and to those feelings. You want to practice bringing those on so that you can learn that you can get through them and you don't have to fight them. Remember that the idea of exposure is to learn that you can manage these feelings of anxiety, the uncertainty, the unwanted thoughts, obsessional thoughts. You can manage those better than you think you can. Now, the last part of this form has to do with what to do after the exposure is over. And again, this is something that I think a lot of people doing exposures, a lot of therapists sometimes, they don't focus as much on consolidating what you're getting out of the exposure once the exposure is over. So again, you want to remain in the exposure until you feel like, hey, this situation isn't dangerous. It's not as much as my anxiety level has gone down, but more where you have changed your thinking about the situation and you feel like I can manage the anxiety, I can manage the uncertainty, and my level of perception of risk about this situation or this thought or this body sensation has changed. I feel differently about this situation. And what I want you to do is to describe the outcome of the exposure. What actually happened? What did you predict was going to happen? How long did you think you could stick it out in the situation? And what was the actual result? Was it different from what you thought it would be? What did you do to get through the experience? Hopefully not a ritual or avoidance strategy, but how did you manage? Even when that anxiety was, kind of elevated. And what would happen if you tried this exposure again? What surprised you about the exposure? And what did you learn from the experience? Think about it. These questions are designed to help you to think carefully about what you've learned from the experience. And what you want to have on that form is something to the effect of, well, now I found out that this situation isn't as dangerous as I thought. Or now I found out that I can manage uncertainty for longer than I thought. Or that anxiety itself isn't as dangerous or as unmanageable as I thought it would be. I can do this. I can get through it. And lastly, that third question for after the exposure is about what can you do to vary up the exposure next time? We learn best when we vary by a little bit the exposures that we're doing. Can you do it in a different situation? Maybe around other people. Maybe with a slightly different stimulus. Maybe a different time of day. Maybe a different location. There's so many things you can do to vary up your exposures. And when you vary them up, you stand to learn more, and that learning generalizes to more situations. What you do is you find out that, well, I can do exposure to the bathroom in my house, but also other bathrooms too. Public bathrooms at a mall or at a restaurant or a gas station. Bathrooms in general are safe, not just one particular bathroom. So vary up your exposures. That will help you get the most long-term benefit out of doing it. I know it makes it difficult in the short term to do those varied exposures, but I call that desirable difficulties. We want to make it more challenging on the front end so that you're able to learn that the risk involved is relatively low and that the situations more generally are not as dangerous as you thought and that you can get through the anxiety. So I hope this is helpful as you do exposures. I hope that you'll hit the like button for this one and that you'll subscribe to my channel. Bye.